How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you all made it here today. So today I'm going to be talking about classical music. It's something that I mentioned that I would like to cover in one of the first videos that I made when I reviewed the channel a couple months ago. Classical music is not something I've always been a big fan of. It's something that I've only gotten more into recently, maybe like a year or two ago. I feel like there's this stigma about classical music that it's boring and it's outdated. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it here on this channel is kind of dispel that stigma and really bring out why I really like it. And maybe this video can encourage other people to check out some really neat pieces of music that were written, a couple hundred years ago. Really bring this awareness to this genre of music. And there's so many beautiful pieces of music that come from this era. I think that might be interesting for people to learn more about. So the reason why I picked Beethoven to start off with is because he's one of the really popular names when you hear about classical music. He was one of the most influential composers between the late classical period and the early romantic period in that whole umbrella of classical music. So I thought I'd dig deeper into his beginnings, how he came about writing his first symphony, and eventually I'd like to cover symphonies 1 through 9 that Beethoven did. In fact, another reason why I wanted to do Beethoven is because about a year ago I went to a rendition of Beethoven's 7th Symphony, and that was such a great experience to sit down in an orchestra hall and see this piece of music come to life. I definitely would recommend going to see some of these pieces of music in person. To be honest, if you are under the age of 30, there's not going to be too many other people that are around your age. So yeah, that's why I wanted to start doing videos on classical music, and let's dive right into Beethoven's first symphony. So before we get to the first symphony itself, I'm going to cover some facts about Beethoven's life. I am not going to do a comprehensive video on Beethoven. Maybe in the future I will, but I didn't want to go into too much detail. Otherwise, this video would be about an hour or two long. There's so much to learn about him. So if you want to know more about Ludwig van Beethoven, I suggest that you check out some articles online. So these are more or less the spark notes of Beethoven's life leading up to the point in time where he conducted his first symphony. So Beethoven was born on December 17th, 1770 in Cologne, Germany, born into a musical family. Although his childhood was a bit troubled, his father succumbed to alcoholism, and Beethoven had to drop out of school eventually to work for his family. He really had to earn the money there. In fact, his family's financial state crumbled after his grandfather passed away when he was 11 years old. His grandfather was a singer in the choir of the Archbishop Elector of Cologne, eventually becoming the Kapellmeister, or the director of a choir or orchestra later on. There was already that musical connection within his family there. In Bonn, which was where Beethoven was living during that point in his life, met one of his earliest teachers there, Christian Gottlieb Neef, who was court organist under the Archbishop Elector of Cologne, became Beethoven's de facto teacher or instructor. Beethoven became Neef's assistant in 1782. So with that relationship set in place, Beethoven learned from Neef and his experience. Following year, under Neef's tutelage, Beethoven composed 9 variations on a march by Dressler. Later on, in 1783, Beethoven was made continuo player of the Bonn Opera. Later on, Beethoven played the viola for the orchestra theater in Bonn. So a couple positions that he assumed following his apprenticeship under Neef. What's interesting to note is that Beethoven briefly met Amadeus Mozart around this time, but the visit was cut short due to Beethoven's mother passing away. There's not too much that was recorded about the meeting, but they did, in fact, meet face-to-face at one point in time. During his time in Bonn, Beethoven composed a number of sonatas for the piano, cantatas, concertos, and variations of other composers' works. Later on in 1792, this is pretty important, to the first symphony, Joseph Haydn, who's another big name when it comes to classical music, came into possession of a couple of musical manuscripts that were written by Beethoven. Beethoven had written a couple of musical works that were never produced. They were kind of just sat there. Haydn came across them and was impressed enough by them that he decided that he would mentor Beethoven. A little while after that, Beethoven left for Vienna, Austria. What's interesting to note is that Beethoven's relationship with Haydn was a bit rocky in private, although in public it was very cordial. The reason for this is speculated to be that Haydn was very busy. He had a very busy schedule, and Beethoven was described as a very stubborn student. This relationship only lasted about 2 years, and later after that, Beethoven would go on to state that he had learned nothing from Haydn, which was later to be proven false due to the influences that are very apparent in Beethoven's work following that apprenticeship under Haydn. So it really shows a little bit about Beethoven's personality and character right there. This rocky relationship eventually led to Beethoven seeking lessons from other teachers, specifically violin lessons from Ignaz Schuppanzich, and another cool crossover here with Italian composer Antonio Salieri, who taught Beethoven the Italian composition style. So already before Beethoven really became a big name in Austria, he had met with Mozart and Salieri and Haydn, which there's so many names and crossovers and connections going there. By 1793, Beethoven earned a reputation as being a piano virtuoso. Beethoven did not publish any original works in Vienna until 1795, dedicating himself to his studies of music. So for 3 years, Beethoven didn't release a piece of music, a sheet of music, really. He wanted to make sure that he mastered his style before he started to show the public what he was capable of, which I find to be very fascinating. Finally, in 1795, Beethoven made his public debut in Vienna. In the performance, he concluded one of his piano concertos and a concerto for Mozart. It seems like at around this time, Beethoven would always incorporate Mozart into one of his public performances as a conductor. One final thing before heading into the First Symphony itself. During the mid-1790s, Beethoven began drafting a symphonic piece, which would later become his First Symphony. It would not be revealed to the public until the turn of the century, however. So he would spend a number of years working on drafting the First Symphony. Okay, now we're going to get into the composition and the performance of the First Symphony. Beethoven, as I said before, spent about 5 years working on and off on his symphony. That symphony was mostly completed in 1799, so the year before it was revealed to the public. The First Symphony was very much influenced by Mozart's style and that of his teacher, Haydn. The symphony itself was composed for 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, a couple of trumpets, timpanis, and a collection of strings. The First Symphony is in C major and is made up of 4 movements. There is speculation that the clarinets were included to the piece as an afterthought. Beethoven's First Symphony made its debut on April 2nd, 1800 at the Burgtheater in Vienna. It was a public concert that also included works from Haydn and Mozart. The excessive use of wind instruments was criticized. The reception for his first performance was a bit lukewarm. This is mostly due to the performance coming from the players, I believe. Before the actual performance, there had been an argument between some of the players in the Italian opera orchestra over who would be leading over specific sections, so that might have led to the performance being not as good as it should have been. However, despite this, the publication of Beethoven's First Symphony proved to be increasingly popular to the people of Austria. Okay, before we dive into my thoughts, I just want everybody to know that I'm not expert on music or music compositions. I'm more of a book or movie guy, to be honest. I'm more of an enthusiast when it comes to music, so I'm not going to be able to throw around and understand some terms. I might be able to understand more of the details on the composition of music eventually, but for now, I'm just going to tell how I feel about certain movements. I did used to play the clarinet back in high school and middle school, so I know certain things about music, but I'm definitely no expert on it, so just bear with me with this. Hopefully it'll be a valid analysis on the First Symphony. So from what I gathered, Beethoven introduces himself decently here in this piece. There are hints of his voice in the third movement, but it's very much in the spirit of Mozart and Haydn in overall style. I feel the whole piece is quite forceful and joyful in its mood and tone. The third movement of the piece is my favorite part, personally. There's this continuing uplifting feeling that carries through. There's no wasted melodies or themes. I really love the use of woodwinds in this. It's what really draws me to this specific symphony. Sections of bassoons in movements 1 and 3 are really nice to listen to. I guess since there's not too many brass parts assigned to the symphony, the brass in this piece don't make too much of an impression here. They're brought to the forefront very sparingly, really only to put an exclamation point on the end of a movement. This is most evident at the end of the first movement. Now, looking at the movements individually, the first movement sets the tone with the high use of woodwinds and creating that uplifting, frolicking feeling. It's like there's this big dance going on. It's very evident in movements 1 and 2. The second movement I feel is a bit weak for me compared to movements 1, 3, and 4. So everything that surrounds number 2. It feels a bit directionless to me, but there are flourishes of a decent melody here and there to hold on to. Again, it really goes back to that idea of a ballroom music, and that uplifting, frolicking feeling is very much maintained in the second movement. It's very much like it feels like dancers going around a ballroom, going around and just enjoying the feeling of dancing and being happy in that feeling. As I said before, the third movement is my favorite part of the entire composition. It's also the shortest too, so it gets right to the point. And it's really where Beethoven's voice comes to the forefront. His individuality is really established there. In the fourth movement, there's a comedy going on there that is inspired by Haydn's work. This comes into being with the use of the strings at the very beginning of movement number 4. It's a nice touch to the whole piece. The comedy comes in the form of there's little snippets of strings that open the music, so there's a little, they play for a few seconds, then stop, then there's silence for a couple seconds, and then they play again, just maybe 1 or 2 notes, and then there's a bridge where the whole orchestra comes back together and they start collaborating. Also, I really enjoyed the supporting part of the woodwinds in movement 4. They're whimsical in mood, which I don't feel like was the tone that the woodwinds encaptured in the piece before that. So that was a really, I think that's a highlight to that part of the composition. It's really something that leapt out at me while I was listening. So overall, the first symphony is a decent introduction to Beethoven's music, but it's far from his best work. I think his best work came later on in his career. There are good portions of joyful, forceful melodies in this, but I feel like there's better examples of this later on. Overall, it's a very good first symphony from Beethoven, and this would eventually lead to some really memorable pieces of music in the 19th century. Okay, that's it for today's video. Hopefully some of you liked this. I know that I really enjoyed going over and doing research and listening to one of the masters of that classical genre. If you want to see more videos like this, just click the like button and subscribe. And that's all I have for today. So everyone have a good rest of your day.